Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? So this is Better Design Built Faster, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So just some introductions first. I'm Mason Hale. I'm Chief Technologist at Frog Design, and
I'm Neelan Schwartz. I'm a technology manager in our Austin studio.
And so just a little bit about Frog Design. We are a multidisciplinary strategic design firm. So what that means is we are a consultancy that works with our clients to make products better, whether it's products or software or hardware or combinations of those. So a quick overview of the agenda, what we're going to cover today. We're going to look at how getting greater separation between UI and the logic in applications and websites helps improve the process and helps improve the results that you get with the design. So we're going to go through a little bit of looking at UI trends and how we kind of got to where we are today, maybe a little bit about where we're going. And then we're going to look at a web example to dig into that a little bit deeper. Then we're going to look at a Windows Presentation Foundation example, and then go through some conclusions. So before we get started, I had a quick question. I was curious, how many people in the audience would consider themselves a designer? Just by show of hands, how many people out there are designers? Okay. So how many people consider themselves developers? So a lot of developers. Now, how many people consider themselves both a designer and a developer? So a few, pretty good number. Okay, that's good to see. All right, so just kind of getting into the UI trends, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but if you think back in time, in the early days of computing, the user interface was light bulbs and switches and a very physical user interface. You directly manipulated the bits on the computer, and then eventually you got to punch card machines, punch cards to encode the bits that are going to tell the computer what to do. And then after that, we got to command line user interfaces. And these focused on expert users. So you had very different applications. Each application had a very different UI from the others. So you saw that people had to learn macro languages for this specific program. All the keyboard shortcuts were different. Does anybody remember the keyboard overlays that they used to have for like WordPerfect and Lotus 1-2-3? So that was sort of indicative of that. So that industry is long gone. I don't know. Let's try and, okay. So the next step was really the graphical user interface, or the GUI. And it was meant to address that problem, the inconsistency between applications. So the basic idea is that the operating system set some guidelines and provided a toolkit so that when an application developer built their application following those guidelines, a user could learn one application and transfer that knowledge to the other application. So you got this cross-application consistency. That toolkit also saved the developers time because they didn't have to go in and build these menu systems by scratch. So it sped up development. It also had the benefit to the user. But you can still see that the look and feel is still pretty utilitarian at this point. There's not a lot of visual glitz going on in the user interface. And then the web happened. And so this is a real interesting time where, and I describe it here as a Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian era is sort of a geological, in the period, it's an evolutionary term. So in the fossil record, several million years ago, it's the point at which the number of species grew exponentially. So you went from thousands of species to millions of species in a very short period of time. And the web is very much like that in the sense that we went from having hundreds, maybe thousands of different software applications to in a short span of a couple of years to millions and millions of websites. And you had people out there that were building websites that, if you think about them, are a lot like applications. And they were trying out new ideas. They were pushing the boundaries of the technology in new ways. And so you saw a lot of new ideas evolve out of that really didn't exist before. You see things like the shopping cart that is sort of ubiquitous now, but wasn't really a concept before then. These ideas worked and they stuck and they held on. You see tab-based navigation bars, search boxes, all these sort of things are these conventions that evolve from the web. And so the interesting thing is you see, right on the heels of that, this is Windows XP, and similar sorts of things happened on the Mac, for example. But you notice a few things. You notice some of those web conventions start bleeding over into the operating system. You see the search box. You see the hyperlinks. You see tab-based navigation showing up more prominently. You see a much more rich visual experience in the environment. And just like a website's, I guess one thing is the website showed that you didn't necessarily need visual consistency for a user to understand what's going on. Websites looked very different from one another, but they followed the conventions. And so that conventional consistency between them that made it so users would understand how the website worked. So it sort of opened up this idea that you could have applications that looked very different from each other, but would still be consistent. Also, another interesting thing that's going on at the same time, you have, and this is Outlook Web Access, which you've probably heard from some of the AJAX and Atlas talks, that this was one of the very first, if not the first, AJAX application, before that term was coined. But you see a lot of these web applications taking on the attributes of desktop applications, a lot higher performance, a lot more interactive. And so that's an interesting thing too. You see the web sort of approaching this desktop-like environment. You also see these interesting hybrids where it's not really clear what's on the web and what's not sometimes. So some examples here, we've got iTunes Music Client. So you have a desktop application that basically has an embedded web browser control in it that's pulling a lot of its content, the iTunes Music Store, from the web. But to the user, that's a seamless experience. They don't really need to understand where that boundary is. In the screenshot for Google on the left, it's kind of hard to read, I know, but if you install the Google desktop software application, it'll let you search your hard drive and does a lot of interesting things. But one of the kind of bizarre things when you first see it is if after that you go visit the Google website and type in a search, sometimes you'll get these results like the one I highlighted in red here that are actually on my local machine. So it's kind of an interesting thing to go to a website and search and get results that are on my computer. And again, that's sort of crossing this boundary between what's on the web, what's on the desktop. Oh. Can you, sorry. Last example here is the gadgets. So this is widgets, Apple's dashboard. So you have these new mini applications that are built using web-based technologies. So these widgets are little micro applications that are built using XML and JavaScript technologies. Okay, so where is this going? So if we go, and this is a simplified scale, but there's a physical UI, directly manipulating the bits in the computer to CLUI, command line user interface, and then that evolves to a graphical user interface. And I feel like we're on the verge of the next step. And what is that next step? But we're on the verge of a new UI paradigm. And so what is that? So I think it is essentially the merging of these web worlds and desktop worlds. So you have desktop applications which traditionally are maybe less visually interesting, less interactive than a website, but more robust, higher performance. You see the desktop applications, if you've seen any of these Windows Presentation Foundation sessions, that the desktop apps are getting much, much richer. And then at the same time, you see on the websites, you see the web applications getting much more robust. So things like Atlas and AJAX are helping push that up. And they're converging on a single point. And so that's a real interesting effect, and it's sort of interesting to think about where that goes. And so this is just kind of looking a little bit at the technology. Another trend you sort of see, and this is a table listing a bunch of different technologies that you might use to build an application. And the columns show which language you use to build the UI versus the logic for the application, as well as some of the tools. But the interesting thing here is you notice that there's this trend to have a separation in that you have a lot of these markup languages that are evolving to describe the user interface. And it's a separate language than you use to do the logic for the application. And so it's something that in Windows Presentation Foundation, there's XAML, but that's just one example of a larger trend. You see that the web is probably the first example of that, where you had CSS and HTML providing that separation, but also Zool, which is used in the Firefox browsers and other applications. You see Macromedia's got a product called Flex that has a markup language as well that provides that separation. So it's sort of a larger trend that's happening. So I think that's one thing that you can look at as sort of evidence of this new platform that's coming out. That's probably an attribute that we would look for. So to dig in a little bit and look at a more concrete example, I'm going to hand it off to Neelan.
Hi. So Frog Design has been engaged with Blockbuster.com to redesign their website. That will be coming soon. So in your typical process, it might be ideal to have one person who understands both design and technology building out your site. So if that person launches Photoshop, they'll understand that the designs they come up with, they'll understand really how to design such that when they get into their text editor, it's actually going to be a buildable design. So it's nice if you have that kind of person who is both the designer and the developer, but it doesn't scale very well. And so more likely, you'll end up with a number of roles on your team. So you'll have somebody who's your information architect that we call a design analyst at Frog. So they are really largely responsible for putting the information architecture together and putting out the wireframes. And so those documents will feed into the designer, who is going to take those wireframes and start applying visual design to the comps. Those same wireframes will end up with the developer, who uses Eclipse or a Java IDE to start the back-end development process. The visual design will eventually, after the comps have been approved, will make it to the design tech, who's going to start firing up their text editor and turn that into CSS and HTML.
Just by the way, the reason we're using the Java example, that's what Blockbuster's using on their site.
Right. So eventually, you marry up the CSS, all the images, the HTML, and the Java. You end up with your website. So when we're talking about wireframes, this is what we're talking about. Basically, just laying out the gross areas on the page for what kind of content goes where, but not really applying any visual design to the site. Excuse me. So when we were talking about separation of content from presentation, and really we're talking about how to divide that up between the server side and the client side. So you've got your application server on your server, and in this case, running it's a Java backend, and you've got your client side, which will be your web browser. So you can have any number of different languages on your application server. All of those are ultimately going to spit out HTML. And a lot of times, certainly further, longer ago than today, you would find that you would have data layout and style all messed up in one big ugly file. It's all messed up. It's all in your HTML, and it's not very cleanly separated. It's hard to maintain. So when you start adding in CSS, you can start pulling some of your font information, your color information into this presentation layer, a little bit separated from your HTML, and so things start becoming a little bit more maintainable. And you see that there. Even better than that would be to pull all your layout information. Maybe not lay your page out in tables. Maybe pull floats and other positioning information up into your style sheet, along with your fonts and your colors. And at that point, your HTML really just becomes data. And it's a really nice, clean separation, and it's a whole lot more maintainable and scalable. So this is an example, it's a generic example, of the type of HTML that we ended up with Blockbuster. What you really see here is there's really no presentation information at all. You're just describing your content. You'll notice a couple of empty divs and spans above and below the content here, and that's really just kind of future-proofing the HTML. You don't really necessarily know where the design's going to go early on in your project. So basically, if you have your wireframe and you pull this, you generate this HTML based on your wireframe, it allows you to, your visual designers, to keep iterating through their design while the back-end team is working on their back-end to produce this HTML here. The specific example will be, and we'll see this in just a few minutes, in the divs and spans, that allowed us to ultimately add some rounded corners on some of our content containers, and we didn't have to touch the HTML at all. The markup was already there. And so that was a real nice sort of validation of adding in this protective layer here. So this is an example of the type of wireframe HTML that we ended up with sort of early in the process. And what you'll notice is you've got your navigation up top, and your primary content is on the left-hand side of the page. You've got some secondary content on the right side of the page, and there's a footer at the bottom. With the relatively simple swapping out of CSS, you are able to basically sort of follow the designer's whim and or the client's whim and change some stuff around relatively painlessly. So just by swapping out this one CSS file, and when you reload, you now see that you've moved your top nav down into the left. You've moved your right secondary content into the left side as well, and you've shifted your right content over. And so, it's really powerful just being able to leave your HTML alone and just iterate over the CSS and swap stuff back and forth. So with another change, as the design matures and more of the visual elements are added into the design, you continue to work on your CSS, and at this point, you end up with something that starts looking pretty close to the end visual design of the site. Really, the layout hasn't changed anymore, but you're able to start throwing in your images and your rollover effects. And all that's happening, like I said, without having to touch the HTML, which you handed off the spec to the back-end team some months before. So what we end up with then is a process that looks a little bit more like this now. At the end of the wireframe stage, after the wireframes are basically pretty mature, you can hand those off to our design tech, who produces the HTML wireframes and hands that off to the back-end developer. And that's essentially a contract. So you really don't want to change the HTML too much at that point. But like I said, we've added in some protective measures to prevent too much changing at that point. The other sort of larger thing going on here is we are able to carry on visual design and CSS development sort of simultaneously. And so that's a real powerful thing. The design is happening totally independent of the Java development that's going to spit out the HTML. And so in this slide here, you'll see that the HTML is a much thinner layer. It's just semantic markup at this point. And you marry that up with the CSS, and you end up with your website.
Okay, thanks, Neelan. So now we're going to look at some WPF examples and looking at how the separation using those technologies also impacts the process. So just to start with another process diagram, similar sort of thing where we have people in orange using tools and blue to output green documents. And so this is a pretty typical software development process. You have marketing starts using a tool like Word to create a marketing requirements document. And then that feeds into an analyst who's going to take the requirements and also use a tool like Word to create a functional specification document. And that may lead to a technical architect who's going to take that and create a software architecture using a tool like Visio or UML. And then that software architecture is going to go to a developer, team of developers who are going to use a development tool like Visual Studio to create the application code in C++. And so that's, and then you end up with the app, and that's basically it.
What about visual design?
So design, so then we're going to add in some design. And this is actually kind of typical of the process, that often design is an afterthought and that it gets tacked on at the end. So we see that you have a designer's added in, uses the marketing requirements and a tool like Photoshop to create some UI design specs that will be handed over to the developer. And then it falls on the developer to take the user interface design and the software architecture and merge those into an application. And that's a pretty high calling for someone to take bitmap images and convert them to C++. Of course, there's good tools to do that, but it's a challenge. So to give you an example of what those specs look like, this is an example actually borrowed from Robbie Ingesbritten, but for some early Windows design. But you can see we call this a red line document. So you have a design comp of what the UI should look like, but you add in specs around what fonts and sizes you should use, what the pixel dimensions of the various elements are, what the colors are, et cetera. And so this is the sort of thing that a developer would use to implement the user interface. So to kind of explain at a deeper level at the how the technology is playing into this, this is a simple diagram of how the parts of a WinForms application might be set up. So you could have some separation between your application logic and a program CS file apart from the UI that might be in a form.cs file. With Avalon or Windows Presentation Foundation, you would have a XAML file that contains the user interface definition, and that's a big difference. It goes from a programming language to a declarative markup language, and that means that there's a different set of tools that you can use to define that. It also opens it up to a different skill set of person. So you don't need someone who knows how to write C# code to get in and define the user interface. You can have someone that can generate XAML code, and so a typical approach is that you have the style and layout included in the same file or sets of files, but there's an additional approach where you can separate that out, where you can have your styles for your controls in a separate layer and share those across applications. And that would be apart from the layout, similar to the CSS example that we looked at before. So to show an example of this, well, first, this is just showing an example of some WPF application. So this is an internal prototype we built just to try out some ideas using the software. And the interesting thing is that when you have the better capabilities that the Windows Presentation Foundation gives you, you're able to try out new things that you aren't able to do before, at least not do as easily as before. So, I don't know, just an example there. No, I don't want to.
Not that one?
No. So this is an example of some simple controls. So if we have an app with various user interface controls and you don't add any special styling, it looks like this. It looks like the standard Windows XP control styles. And then you can go in and make a simple change. So here we're going to uncomment a line. All this is going to do is load in a separate XAML style sheet into the application. We'll recompile, run it again, and you can see we've customized the styles here. So we have bubbling button designs. So on the rollover states, you have the progress bars, a lot more interactive and rich. And so this enables you to, in your application, give it your own brand, your own personality. Sort of similar to the way websites have their own look and feel from website to website. You don't have every website look like every other website. And I think that's a pattern that you're going to see more and more of in applications. And again, you see we're still following the same conventions. Users aren't going to have a hard time understanding what this application is or how it works. It just has its own look and feel. Okay. All right, so this is just some other examples. This is for the September PDC last year. We worked with Microsoft to build some demos there. And this shows a little more extreme example of style and layout changing. So the scenario here is you have a photo store, and you want to allow, you want to support different types of users with that photo store. So this is showing a professional view for the professional photographer. They don't want a lot of images and stuff like that. They just want to see the files and add them and move on. This next one is more of a consumer-facing application, and it's the exact same code underneath with just XAML changes. So the application logic is exactly the same. Those files don't change at all. But by swapping out the XAML layer, you're able to change the layout and the styles to appeal to a more consumer audience. And you can see some of the same control styles there. And then lastly, this is, again, the same code, but more for the 10-foot UI. So a design concept for someone viewing this on, say, a television screen or perhaps a kiosk where you have more tab-based navigation as opposed to a mouse control. And but again, the same application logic beneath. All we're doing is changing the user interface layer. So the point is there's a great degree of flexibility that Windows Presentation Foundation gives you with user interface. So if we look at the process and how that changes, this is actually the really cool part. So you can see we still have the same process of going through marketing to functional spec and software, but the big difference is that you have the designers able to work directly in the same code with the developers. So there's tools like the Microsoft Interaction Expression Designer, or also known as Sparkle. That was the code name. But they're able to, a designer is able to directly create their design, and that outputs XAML code that then the developer can open up in Visual Studio and add their logic to, and also update the XAML code as well. So you get this really nice round trip where you have the designer and the developer working together as one. If you think back to when Neelan showed the initial process slide for this designer/developer person, in a way that's kind of the ideal scenario, because that's how you can get it done the fastest. And you have someone who knows what they want and they know how to build it. The problem is that doesn't scale. And so what this enables is it to scale over multiple people acting together as one, which we found has been really very productive. I know the people on our team that are working in this are really excited about being able to work together like that. So some conclusions. So the first one is that translation equals information loss. So when we think back to the process diagrams, as you go from each step in the process, there's layers of translation that are going on. There's a layer of translation from the person's ideas in their head through the tool to the output. So the tool has some impact on what you can do. It constrains your ideas based on the capabilities of the tool. There's another layer of information loss when someone takes the output from one person and then they have to interpret it and create a new output. So, for example, taking the wireframe diagrams and creating visual design. You have one person who takes the wireframes from another person and has to translate those ideas into a visual design. Or maybe a better case is a developer taking bitmap redline documents and needing to convert that from a bitmap image to code. So the net result is the information loss results in a slower process and inferior results. And the inferior results really come from that information loss, that some of the ideas that were there in the beginning don't make it through to the end or get modified en route. It's like a long game of telephone, where you have all the people on the team trying to figure out what the other one's trying to achieve. So a good step there is to enable the designers to work directly in the medium. So having a tool that lets them directly work, and in this example, a good example is Sparkle. Enabling the designers to directly work in the XAML code is a huge win. It's even better if you get the designers and developers working together at the same time with the same files and getting that round trip I was talking about. Another idea is that better design tools equal better design. So the capabilities of what your tool can do really constrain what you can do and what you can achieve. So obviously having better tools helps that. So a key thing there is a text editor is not a good visual design tool. And it's interesting that we spend so much time doing design in text editors. I don't know, that's maybe a dirty little secret in the industry, but that's the way it is. Another thing to point out is Photoshop is not really a good interaction design tool. It's a good tool for designing bitmap images, but it's not good for designing how those things should interact with the user. And because of that, it constrains your thinking, and it makes it harder to communicate the ideas, and thus you end up with more information loss. Another point, going with the flow is easier than swimming upstream. So one thing that we found is XAML is designed to build applications, and it really feels like it. The acronym is XML Application Markup Language, or at least that was the initial acronym. So it's an application markup language, and that's a great thing. HTML was designed to create documents, and it feels like it. So it's the hypertext markup language. And so using that to create application designs has some inherent limitations. There's a little bit of fighting the model to create, the initial designs of web pages, if you remember back, looked more like Word documents than application. And that was the initial intent. And so a lot of CSS and the stuff that we add to that is in a way a retrofit versus something that was there at the very beginning. So what does that mean for the web? So obviously we do a lot of web work. We think that the web is a great platform, and so I'm not trying to say that HTML is bad and we should stop using it. But there's potential. You see, Ajax shows a lot of potential to take it to the next step. But I feel like there's too much time that you spend working around the browser limitations and incompatibilities. So there's some great tools coming out that help that. But ask anybody who's worked on Ajax, and that's an inordinate amount of the time is spent dealing with those issues. And you need to have some extensions to the standards for HTML to really support richer user interfaces in a more application model. There's this interesting tag. It's not a standard tag yet, but it's called Canvas. It was originated by Apple in their dashboard widgets that enables you to directly draw shapes to the screen. And that's been picked up by Firefox, and it looks interesting. It looks interesting to finally have the capability not to just draw rectangles on the screen and layer those to get effects in a web browser. And then finally, we just need better visual and interaction design tools for the web. I think that's a huge limitation. And I think over 10 years later, it's crazy that we're still writing HTML and CSS by hand. That if you know the history of the web, you know that Tim Berners-Lee didn't envision it that way. I mean, some of the first tools that he worked on were visual web design tools. And so I think that's a big hole. So next, we left some time for some questions, and I hope maybe we were thought-provoking. So I'm curious to know what you think. No. Sure, please go up to the mic.
Well, I dig your argument. I mean, I don't want to question the argument, but what I do see is now we have designers. CSS is not going to go away.
No.
And XAML needs to be learned, or can have tool support, whatever. So, is there, in your opinion, convergence or tool separation, or is it going to go further apart? Because you mentioned that web design and application design is converging. So, how do you see that now that we have two languages still for each of them to design?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. I know that.
So who should we ask then?
I think time will tell. I don't think anybody really knows the answer of what's going to happen. I think it's interesting that in both the web world, you see this trajectory to become more application-like, and that's going in a good direction. And in the desktop world, with WPF and other things, it's not the only thing out there, but I'd say it's definitely on the leading edge. Is pushing to a rich experience. And those are converging on a single point. What that looks like, I don't know. But I think there'll be different tools. Do you have?
I was just going to say that WPFE is probably going to help, in some way or another, help us reach a conclusion sooner than later. CSS, being where it is and continuing to evolve, and WPF making its first entry into the web via WPFE is sort of going to bring that to a head. Who knows exactly what it's going to look like, but there's surely going to be some ties in between the two, and I imagine that both standards will continue to evolve from there.
Thanks.
I have a question about connected to separating HTML and CSS, because there is sometimes some problem where we're working with ASP.NET controls generated code, and there is some challenge for people, developers and web developers. How do you manage it?
So I guess one underlying thing, whether you're talking about ASP.NET or just in general, getting really clean separation with CSS in a web environment is pretty hard to pull off. So you see some great examples like the CSS Zen Garden. I don't know if you've seen that site, but it's a great site that shows how people can submit different CSS files to give the site a different look and feel. Same thing happened on the Mix website. But achieving that in the real world takes a lot of work. Getting that last 10% is a big pain. Within the ASP.NET, you can write your own custom controls to take more control over that.
Yes, but probably I don't know or write again all the controls.
Right. I mean, ultimately, high-level CSS programming is a bit of a black art, and you need to know all the ins and outs and how the different browsers work together and don't work together, and work around all those different things. And it requires a pretty advanced, strategic thinking around how you're going to structure your files, how you're going to structure your site to take advantage of that. And I don't believe there's any one-size-fits-all solution. I think the code snippet we put up there for Blockbuster was interesting in that it was a very simplified sort of container model that gave you just about all the hooks you need to style that chunk pretty much any way you might want to. So we found that added a little bit of overhead to the code. You could have stripped that out and the page would have been lighter, but the benefit is it gave you the flexibility to change the UI, the layout, and the style drastically. So I don't know, maybe there's room for Microsoft or others to improve the controls to give you that cleaner separation. But I think to really use that effectively, you're going to need to get in some deep CSS experience. Anything to add?
Well, I was going to say that the controls have gotten better with ASP.NET 2.0. The controls are generating a little bit more standard markup, particularly when we're talking about radio buttons and checkboxes. We had some issues, not with this project, a different project, where the output was not quite what we expected and not what we would have written up by hand, but the controls have gotten quite a bit better. To some extent, you can get it in and monkey around with how the output's going to come out. So combining that with a CSS class attribute for your controls, and you should be able to achieve a relatively high degree of quality markup.
Thanks. Question?
Hi, it's a good-looking presentation. Thanks for formatting it the way you did. And the questioner just before asked my first question, which was, what's the advantage of forcing people who are already skilled in CSS techniques and markup techniques and so on to learn a new thing? But I have a second question.
Okay.
And that's about the single-file XAML approach, where designers and developers work on the same file. I've been trying to picture the workflow, and I'd be interested in hearing how you handle this, when multiple people work on a single file simultaneously. In the HTML model, we're used to referring to external assets, whether images, animation sequences, video, audio, all those things. We refer to them so different people can work on the same project at the same time without colliding with each other. If interactions and line art animations are in the same control file that is used by the development team, do you mark off different lines of XAML to say this person can touch this but cannot touch this block? Or if they consciously work on different parts of the file, you could do some type of merge at the end of the day's work session. How do you deal with that when multiple people, when the entire team is working on a single file at one time? What have you done?
So it's not a single file. That's one part. So the application would be split into multiple files. So there's maybe the example is maybe a little bit simplified, but you have your C# files, and there'll be multiple of those. You have multiple XAML files, but you can separate the control styles into a shared file, and that you have a smaller team that's working on that. And
so some of the styling information is still by reference, some of the coding that's not in XAML is still by reference, and that's how you coordinate things among a team?
Well, you would have sort of a contract based on the IDs and the names of the elements that the other XAML files in your code will refer to. And so in your styling file, you'll define what that should look like and how it should interact.
Okay, thanks for the lead. I'll look more into that. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? One more? We have plenty of time left, it looks like.
Turns out.
I could probably come up with a whole bunch. I'm an architect, and you didn't ask if there were any architects in the audience, but the designers and the developers and everybody work for me, and they're all a pain in the butt, by the way. Sorry. So the black art.
Yes.
Who's the black artist? Is it, I mean, most of the designers, you know, they know enough to be dangerous, and they can really get in and do a lot of damage, create some really cool stuff in CSS.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you know, the technical minutia of cross-browser compatibility and how you structure your files and, you know, the fact that you can cascade the files and, you know, sort of inherit and extend. A lot of times the designers don't really get those aspects, and even if they do, it's hard for them to, you know, take a team approach to really structuring that stuff so everybody else can use it effectively. So I struggle with the designer being the black artist, but then the developer, you know, he's putting up screens that are yellow and green. You know,
Right.
it's just so who's the black artist?
So we end up with a specialized role. So, and this is pretty common actually in design firms. We have a role that we call design technologist. Other people have content engineers, things like that. So it's a specialist that focuses on those UI technologies and specifically bridging that gap between design and development and working with both teams to understand what the development needs are and what the design needs are. But it is a very specialized role, and you know, a lot of the reason for that is due to browser incompatibilities and lack of tool support.
I agree with you. There's no good CSS management tool out there. I mean, I've seen a lot of bits and snatches of good stuff. Why don't you guys put one out? Seems like you have the capacity.
We're a services company.
Not exactly a tools provider.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Hey, I'm interested in hearing just a little bit about how you guys plan on deploying applications to real users. We've seen a lot of cool demos, but how do we actually, you know, start doing this and deploy it to real people that are not very well informed about WPF and requirements and different things?
Right.
Just how are you guys going to approach that as you start doing projects?
So we're doing projects right now. It's just based on the roadmap for the projects, targeting, you know, when WPF will be released. So there's always a lot of business considerations around the audience size, but all the estimates I've seen of the uptake's going to be pretty quick for a lot of this, since it'll be built into Vista and run on XP. And so I guess that's the first question, is kind of timing the deployment.
Yeah, I mean, how are you going to, you know, you've built this really cool thing, it does a lot of cool stuff, but not everybody's going to have these bits installed.
Right.
How do you get that to them? How do you make them want to get access to that?
I mean, there's a chicken and egg problem there, but I think this is part of why I talk about there being sort of a next generation of UI, in the sense that it'll be clear to the users that this was an old generation application and this is the new generation application. They won't know exactly why, but it will feel different. And I think based on that, hopefully, you know, the software companies will make compelling experiences and use the technology right, so that, you know, once the user gets the bits installed for one app, then they're good for all the other apps. And at some point that dam breaks, and it's out there, and you can depend on it. But it's gonna take that first step, and I feel pretty confident that that's going to happen pretty quickly.
Okay, thanks.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what tools you are using today, and if that's going to change over the next month, such as the expression family, particularly on the website. For WPF, it's pretty obvious. Thanks.
Right. So on the website, we use a lot of the tools that we showed up there. So we have this design analyst role that's using Visio or OmniGraffle to do sitemaps and wireframes, and then we have a lot of people using Photoshop to do visual design, and then it usually falls in this design technologist role to mock up the page. There might be a little bit of Dreamweaver, but quite honestly, not much. No. And it's usually straight to a text editor and chopping up images for them. And I think that's the biggest, you know, hole in the tool space. Got to talk to some of the people on the Expression web designer team. They seem really committed to taking that to the next level. So we definitely want better tools, but we just need to wait and see what comes out of that. We also, I mean, there's version control and all these sorts of things as well that we'll use. So I guess that's it.
are you in any kind of waiting mode on like the Expression Web Designer? You see big gains from that?
I'd say, it's anticipation mode, maybe wait and see, but we will definitely try it out as soon as it comes out and try it and see how that works. An example there that we used internally when we were first playing around with WPF was we used it for prototyping. We used Flash to do a lot of prototyping internally, and so we took a project and so this is like a software application for a handheld media player product. And we had two developers, one on Avalon or WPF and one on Flash, going in parallel, building the same prototype. And it was shocking to us, but it was kind of cool that the Avalon one got done sooner. So that, there's a lot of productivity. But we'll probably do something similar when some of these other tools come out to kind of do a parallel track to get an apples-to-apples comparison.
Thanks. You mentioned Flash. I see, at least over in Europe and Scandinavia, where I'm from, there's a lot of Flash. Do you see any penetration into that market segment from WPF and WPFE and things like that?
Yeah, so a lot of people raise that comparison. I think there's in the straight WPF, it's a huge difference. So we use Flash a lot for a lot of prototyping and the occasional web user interface. I think the difference for me is that Flash is a good designer tool and a good designer/developer tool, but it doesn't necessarily appeal to the core developer audience as much. You see Macromedia addressing that with their Flex product that comes out. That's kind of more of a developer tool. The other thing that's sort of limiting there is the fact that the Flash files are binary, and so it makes it harder to version and share across a bigger team. So that makes it a little bit harder to scale. There's workarounds for that as well. I think there is definitely be some overlap. I know I saw the WPF in a browser, and it's loading a plugin that's WPF player. You see that running on a Mac in Safari, and it's very Flash-like. I think that the difference here is it's kind of coming more from the desktop application space to the web from that direction, rather than Macromedia and Flash kind of coming from the web browser direction to the desktop. So I think they're definitely overlapping. They're just coming from different directions. And it'll be interesting to see how that turns out.
Thanks. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Hey, I've got a quick question just basically about, I'm interested to know whether you've mucked around with any kind of continuous integration or like continuous build with WPF and any lessons you've learned or any problems you faced.
We've done some of the continuous build. I'm not sure on a WPF project. So there's like cruise control is one of the tools for that, and unit testing and things. I don't know I guess I haven't seen a unit test framework for XAML code. But that's
my next question.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. It tends to be, you try it out, the cycles tend to be very quick. Our designers are really excited. They hit F5 and a desktop app compiles and runs, and they can play with it. And that's just sort of a really big aha moment. I think it's another step to get them to think about test cases and unit testing and things like that. But I'd like to see it.
And what kind of source control were you using? So I'm guessing something like source safe with an exclusive checkout model won't really work.
No, we actually use Subversion.
Okay.
So it's concurrent. So you can have multiple people working in the same files that'll merge directly. And so that's one great thing, that the fact that XAML's XML, it's text, you can merge those changes.
I guess that's relevant to the guy that asked about the workflows as well, because Subversion will take a lot of the pain out of merging changes. Okay, thank you. Great presentation. Cheers.
Anyone else? Going once? Twice? Okay, well, thanks everybody. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of the conference.